Something historic is unfolding right now and hardly anyone's talking about it. The Democratic Party isn't just struggling, it's fracturing from within. In Illinois, the very state once seen as their stronghold, two of their top leaders, Governor J.B. Pritzker and Mayor Brandon Johnson, are facing a full-scale rebellion from the last group anyone expected, their own state troopers. And it's not just about law enforcement. It's about power, control, and what happens when people finally say enough. What's happening in Illinois right now could be the blueprint for the collapse of the Democratic machine nationwide. Now, I know what you're thinking. Political parties rise and fall all the time, right? That's just how democracy works. And you'd be absolutely correct. But what we're witnessing right now isn't a typical swing in voter preference or a bad election cycle. This is something deeper, something structural. Think of it like a building where the foundation has been slowly cracking for years, and suddenly one support beam gives way and the whole thing starts to buckle. That's what's happening to the Democratic Party, and the cracks are showing everywhere. Let me start with the numbers, because numbers don't lie, and these numbers are absolutely devastating. Across the country, Democrats have been hemorrhaging voters in nearly every demographic you can measure. We're talking about men, independents, suburban women, younger voters who were once considered safe, even minority communities that have historically leaned blue. In roughly 30 states that track voter registration by party, Democrats have been losing registered voters in record numbers, while Republicans have been gaining ground in every single one. The swing we're talking about here is somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 million voters. Let that sink in for a moment. 4 or 5 million people who once identified with the Democratic Party have actively changed their registration or walked away entirely. Now, you can't lose millions of registered voters and still pretend everything's fine. That's not a messaging problem. That's not a bad candidate or a bad news cycle. That's a trust problem. That's people saying, I don't recognize this party anymore, or they stopped listening to me, or I don't feel safe under their leadership. And when people stop feeling heard, they start walking away. It's as simple as that. But here's the thing. Numbers are just symptoms. They tell you something's wrong, but they don't tell you why. To understand what's really happening, you have to look at the places where loyalty used to be automatic, where Democratic dominance was taken for granted. Places like Illinois. Illinois for decades has been the heart of the Democratic political machine. Chicago, the state's crown jewel, has been run by Democrats for generations. The governor's mansion, the state legislature, city hall, all blue all the time. It was supposed to be a fortress, a place where progressive policies could be tested and celebrated, a model for the rest of the country. But in 2025, that fortress is crumbling, and the cracks are coming from the inside. At the center of the story are two men, Governor J.B. Pritzker and Mayor Brandon Johnson. Both of them built their political reputations on one core promise: resistance. Resistance to federal immigration enforcement, resistance to what they called the MAGA agenda, resistance to anything that didn't align with their progressive vision. They made Illinois a sanctuary state, passed laws that restricted local law enforcement from cooperating with ICE, and stood on stages in front of cheering crowds promising that Illinois would be a safe haven, a place where all residents would be protected no matter what. It was powerful rhetoric. It energized their base. It won them elections. But there was a problem, and it's a problem that a lot of politicians forget. You can't govern on rhetoric alone. At some point, reality catches up, and in Illinois, reality just kicked down the door. Because the very people sworn to uphold state law, the Illinois State Police, the men and women who put on the uniform every day and risk their lives to protect their communities, are now refusing to obey the politicians running the state. That's not a small thing. That's not a bureaucratic squabble. That's a rebellion. And it's happening because those officers reached a breaking point. So what exactly pushed Illinois state troopers to this point? To understand that, you have to understand what it's been like to be a law enforcement officer in Illinois over the past few years. Morale has been in the basement. Recruitment numbers have hit all-time lows. Turnover has skyrocketed.
Officers have been told to stand down, to release suspects, to ignore federal warrants, to watch as their authority gets undermined day after day by politicians who seem more interested in virtue signaling than in public safety. Imagine going to work every day knowing that the rules keep changing, that the very laws you're supposed to enforce are being rewritten or ignored based on political convenience. Imagine arresting someone for a serious crime only to have them released within hours because of some new policy. Imagine being told by your mayor and your governor that cooperating with federal immigration agents makes you complicit in justice, even when those agents are trying to remove dangerous criminals from your community. How long do you think you put up with that before you said, enough? Well, Illinois state troopers reached that point. And when leadership ignores reality long enough, the system eventually corrects itself. That correction isn't polite, and it doesn't wait for permission. It just happens. And that's exactly what we're seeing in Illinois right now. Then came the spark, a wave of crimes that no amount of political spin could cover up. Violent incidents, some linked directly to individuals who were in the country illegally, who had prior run-ins with law enforcement, who had ICE detainers that were ignored. These weren't abstract policy debates anymore. These were real people, real victims, real communities demanding answers. And when ordinary residents, people who had voted for Pritzker, people who had supported Johnson, started showing up at town halls and city council meetings demanding action, something shifted. For the first time, state troopers said, "We won't ignore the law anymore." They didn't hold a press conference. They didn't issue a statement.
They just started doing their jobs the way they believed those jobs should be done, protecting their communities, cooperating with federal agents when it made sense, and refusing to let politics dictate public safety. And that's when everything changed. Now, quiet defiance can be powerful, but it doesn't always make headlines. What made headlines was what happened next. Operation Midway Blitz. This was a coordinated law enforcement operation led by the Department of Homeland Security, and it resulted in well over 1,000 arrests across Illinois. And we're not talking about random immigration violations here. We're talking about dangerous criminals, individuals with violent histories, repeat offenders, people who posed real threats to the communities they were living in. Pedophiles, gang members, armed robbers, people that any reasonable person would want off the streets. And here's the kicker. Many of those arrests were made possible through the cooperation of Illinois state troopers. Despite the policies, despite the executive orders, despite the political pressure from the governor's office and the mayor's office, the troopers worked with ICE. They shared information, they made arrests, they escorted federal agents into local jails, they helped build the barriers and security perimeters around ICE facilities. They did their jobs. This wasn't about politics, it was about protecting people. It was about saying, we're not going to let ideology put innocent lives at risk. And for the people living in those neighborhoods, for the families who had been terrified by a rising crime, this was a moment of relief. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, someone was acting. But for Governor Pritzker and Mayor Johnson, this was a nightmare. Because Operation Midway Blitz exposed everything they'd promised to prevent. They had stood in front of cameras and told their supporters, "We will not allow our state resources to be used to assist federal immigration enforcement. We will protect every resident of Illinois, regardless of status." And now their own officers were doing exactly what they'd sworn wouldn't happen. The phone lines in the governor's office and the mayor's office started ringing off the hook. Community leaders, bureaucrats, progressive activists, they all wanted explanations. How could this happen? How could the state troopers defy direct orders? Who authorized this? And as the news spread, As images and videos of Illinois troopers working side by side with ICE agents started circulating on social media, the political chaos behind closed doors turned into a full-blown panic. It's like a software company claiming there's a glitch when their users start rewriting the code themselves. The spin machine kicked into overdrive.
Those seats are concentrated in the South and parts of the Midwest, Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, all states currently holding districts that were created or preserved by court order under Section 2. But it doesn't stop there. Combine this ruling with redistricting efforts already underway in states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio, and you're looking at a potential swing of more than 40 seats before a single vote is cast in 2026. 40 seats. That's not a shift, that's a realignment. For Democrats, that's not just a bad election cycle, it's existential. Their entire strategy for maintaining power in the House has relied on these maps. Without them, they would need to win swing districts, competitive, persuadable districts on a scale they haven't managed in years. To progressives, this isn't about lines on a map. It's about ideology, legacy, and control. They argue that removing these districts would dilute minority votes and destroy representation. That without Section 2 protections, states would go back to the bad old days of racial gerrymandering designed to silence Black and Hispanic voters. They see this case as an attack not just on a law, but on the entire civil rights framework built over the last 60 years. And they're not entirely wrong to worry. There are real risks if states abuse their new freedom. But critics of race-based redistricting point out a deeper irony. In trying to end discrimination, these districts ended up codifying it. They created racial partitions, sorted voters into demographic boxes, and told them their identity was more important than their ideas. They made race the predominant factor in political representation, which is exactly what the civil rights movement fought against. The question isn't whether minorities deserve representation. Of course they do. The question is whether the best way to achieve that is by sorting people into districts based on skin color or by creating competitive districts where everyone's vote matters equally. Now the Supreme Court stands at that crossroads and the whole country is watching. Democrats know what's coming. You can hear it in the way they talk about this case. They're calling it a nightmare, a disaster, a five-alarm fire. They're not exaggerating. This is the legal earthquake they've been dreading since Trump reshaped the Supreme Court. And here's the part that makes it even more painful for them. This is a slow-motion defeat they saw coming, but couldn't stop. Because here's the thing about the Supreme Court. It doesn't move fast, but when it moves mountains. And right now, it's preparing to move one that's been sitting in place since the 1988 seconds. The ruling is expected sometime between January and February of 2026. That timeline isn't an accident. It's perfectly calibrated to maximum political impact. By delivering the decision early in the year, the court gives Republican-led state legislators just enough time to redraw their maps before the 2026 midterm elections. And those states are ready. They've been preparing for this moment. Legal teams have draft maps sitting in drawers. Data analysts have been running simulations. The moment the ruling drops, they'll move with surgical precision. But the effects won't be contained to just one election cycle. This is the kind of decision that ripples forward through time, reshaping the political landscape for decades. By 2028, when the next presidential election rolls around, the entire structure of congressional power could look completely different. And it's not just about the maps themselves. It's about everything connected to them. Think about population shifts over the last few years. Millions of people have left blue states like California, New York, and Illinois, moving to red states like Texas, Florida, and Tennessee. Some left for taxes, some for politics, some just for space and sunshine. Whatever the reason, the effect is the same. Blue states are losing population, and red states are gaining it. That means fewer congressional seats for Democratic strongholds and more for Republican ones. The census has already started reflecting this. Now imagine layering the Supreme Court decision on top of those demographic changes. Then add in another factor.
mass deportations, and self-deportations. Over the last year or so, somewhere between 1 and 3 million people who were in the country illegally either left voluntarily or were removed. Most of them were counted in the 2020 census, which inflated population numbers in certain districts that leaned heavily Democratic. When the next census happens, those numbers will shrink, and so will the representation those areas receive. Combine all three forces, this court ruling, population migration, and changing census data, and you're looking at a structural realignment of American politics on a scale we haven't seen since the 1992s. For Democrats, the nightmare scenario isn't just losing seats, it's losing the ability to ever get them back. Because once these districts are redrawn without racial quotas, there's no mechanism to force them back into the old configuration.
Small business owners who had been dealing with rising crime saw arrests being made. This wasn't about being anti-immigrant. This was about being pro-safety. This was about saying that laws matter, that consequences matter, that leadership has a responsibility to protect everyone, not just the people who align with their political ideology. And here's where the national collapse becomes impossible to ignore. Because what happened in Illinois isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a pattern. Look at New York, where even deeply blue districts are starting to swing red in local elections. Look at New Jersey, where voters are fleeing the state in record numbers, tired of high taxes and rising crime, and leaders who seem more interested in virtue signaling than governing. Look at California, where homelessness and drug addiction and failing schools have become so dire that even longtime Democrats are starting to ask, what are we doing wrong? The erosion of trust is happening everywhere. And it's not just about immigration policy or crime, it's about a broader sense that the Democratic Party has lost touch with the concerns of ordinary middle-class Americans. The party that once championed the working man, that stood up for labor unions and factory workers and families struggling to make ends meet, now feels like the party of coastal elites and academic ideologues and activists who care more about pronouns than paychecks. Now, I'm not saying Republicans have all the answers. I'm not saying the other side is perfect. But I am saying that when one party stops listening to half the country or more, they're going to pay a price. And that price is starting to come due. So let's talk about what this means for the future of American politics, because this is where things get really interesting. History doesn't repeat, but it does echo. And right now, that echo sounds like the end of an era. The Democratic dominance that began with FDR, that was built on a coalition of working-class voters, union members, minorities, and urban progressives, that coalition is fracturing. It's not gone yet, but the cracks are widening every day. And what we're seeing is the beginning of a realignment, the kind of political shift that only happens once or twice in a generation. The Democrats are losing the support of middle-class families. They're losing the support of law enforcement. They're losing the support of small business owners. They're losing the support of parents who are worried about what their kids are being taught in school. They're losing the support of people who just want to feel safe in their own neighborhoods. And once you lose that broad middle, the people who aren't ideological, who aren't activists, who just want competent governance and a fair shot at a decent life, it's very hard to win national elections. You can win in big cities, you can win in university towns, you can win in districts where your base is concentrated, but you can't win the presidency. You can't control the Senate. You can't build a governing majority. Think of it like this. When people stop fearing the system and start building alternatives, the old system collapses on its own. And that's exactly what's happening in Illinois. The alternative wasn't a new political party or a revolutionary movement. The alternative was simply law enforcement officers deciding to do their jobs the way they believed those jobs should be done. And that small act of defiance has cascading consequences. It emboldens others. It shifts the conversation.
It changes what's politically possible. And that's why what just happened in Illinois isn't just a scandal. It's a signal. It's a signal that the era of unchallenged progressive dominance in blue states is over. It's a signal that there are limits to how far you can push ideology before people push back. It's a signal that accountability is coming, whether politicians like it or not. Now, where does this leave us? Where does this leave the country? I think we're at a crossroads, and the choices we make in the next few years are going to determine what kind of nation we become. Do we continue down the path of division and dysfunction, where each side demonizes the other and refuses to listen? Or do we start demanding something better from our leaders? Accountability, competence, humility, a willingness to put the country's interests ahead of party loyalty. I'm hopeful, and here's why. I think most Americans, regardless of their politics, are fundamentally decent people who want the same basic things: safety, opportunity, freedom, a fair shot at a good life for their kids. And I think when leaders lose sight of that, when they prioritize ideology over results, people eventually notice. It might take time, it might be frustrating, but eventually the truth comes out and the people make their voices heard. What happened in Illinois is one of those moments. It's a moment where the gap between rhetoric and reality became too wide to ignore. It's a moment where ordinary people, state troopers in this case, decided that enough was enough. And it's a moment that's going to reverberate far beyond Illinois. So, let me conclude this with a few key takeaways because I think it's important to understand not just what happened, but what it means. First, the Democratic Party is experiencing a collapse driven by alienation, overreach, and internal rebellion. They've lost millions of registered voters across the country. They've lost the trust of key demographics, and they're losing control even in their own strongholds. That's not spin, that's reality. Second, the Illinois State Trooper Revolt is the first major crack in the party's authority. It shows that when leaders push too far, when they ask people to ignore common sense and basic safety in the name of ideology, those people will eventually push back. And once that rebellion starts, it's very hard to stop. Third, public sentiment is shifting toward accountability and law enforcement. People are tired of rising crime. They're tired of leaders who make excuses instead of solving problems. They're tired of being told that their concerns don't matter or that they're on the wrong side of history. They want leaders who will listen, who will act, and who will put their safety and their families first. So here's my reflection, and I want you to think about this. The question isn't whether the Democratic Party survives. Political parties are resilient. They adapt, they evolve, they reinvent themselves. The question is whether the Democratic Party can evolve before it becomes irrelevant. Can it rebuild trust with the voters it's lost? Can it acknowledge that some of its policies have failed? Can it find leaders who are willing to put results over rhetoric? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know this. What we're witnessing right now is history turning a corner. And your voice matters in shaping what comes next, because democracy isn't a spectator sport. It's not something that happens to you, it's something you participate in, that you shape, that you fight for. And that's why I want to ask you, if you've been following this far, it means you care about truth, freedom, and where our country is headed. We're watching a political realignment in real time. And the choices we make at the ballot box, in our communities, in the conversations we have with our neighbors, are going to determine what kind of country we leave for the next generation. So, if you believe it's time for accountability and courage and leadership, if you believe that common sense should matter more than ideology, if you believe that the safety and security of American families should be the top priority of every elected official, then I want you to do something for me. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you agree or if you disagree. Tell me if you've seen similar things happening in your own state, your own community. Let's see how many of you think Illinois just showed the rest of America what comes next. Because here's the truth. We're stronger when we're informed. We're stronger when we're engaged. And we're stronger when we refuse to let fear or cynicism or apathy stop us from standing up for what's right. So stay informed, stay engaged, stay hopeful, and let's keep watching, keep learning, and keep fighting for a country that works for everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring.